In this news roundup of the week, the situation deteriorates on the borders of Ukraine, and many are now saying that Putin has made up his mind to take military action. The EU has stepped up its push against member states that won't toe the line, and the UK is getting slapped around by Storm Eunice. But is it climate change, as some are inevitably claiming? My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Slightly shorter episode this week, partly because of the need to do more than usual client work to pay some bills, and partly wanting to get a version of this uploaded a little bit earlier than usual, just in case Storm Eunice, which is hitting where I am right now, should put out the power supply, which is not entirely unheard of. Now, the world still waits to see what's going to happen in Ukraine. In the last couple of days, Moscow has suggested that its forces have started a withdrawal, while NATO and Ukraine have reported that they've seen no evidence of that actually happening. On Thursday, multiple shelling incidents were reported on the line between Ukrainian and Russian forces, including mortar attacks on a kindergarten. Both sides blamed the other for the attack, and it raised fears of the anticipated false flag attack that Russia might use to justify an invasion, as predicted by the Biden administration. Meanwhile, Western leaders have been scrabbling to negotiate with Russia to try to reduce tensions, although it's hard to see how that process does anything but reward Putin by indicating that the threat of violence will bring concessions. In particular, Ukraine won't have been especially thrilled by the fact that French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz have been urging it to implement the Minsk II peace deal. This was a deal brokered by France and Germany in 2015 after the previous Ukraine-Russia conflict. With the way things currently stand, pushing Ukraine to take the actions demanded under that agreement would be a significant victory for Putin. This is because the Minsk II agreement was essentially a victor's settlement imposed on a weak Ukraine. Russia was established as a broker to the deal rather than as a party to it, bizarrely, and it's supposed to see Russia withdrawing its troops from the Donbass in return for Ukraine giving more autonomy to the self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk republics currently under the control of Russian agents. Ukraine is unwilling to give special status to those entities before the Russian withdrawal has taken place, especially since it would effectively give Russia veto power over Ukraine's foreign policy decisions. Russia, in the meantime, is showing no interest in withdrawing from anything. Both sides therefore point to the non-compliance of the other as to why the agreement hasn't moved ahead. Putin would achieve significant goals if Ukraine were to be pushed into implementing Minsk II in the way that he would want, without Russia doing its part. And it's why he's demurred from acting on a recent vote by Russia's parliament simply to recognise the independence of those two Russia-backed regions, because to do so would be to break the terms of a Minsk II agreement, effectively killing it. And he presumably doesn't want to do that so long as France and Germany are willingly using it as a lever to pressurise Ukraine. On Tuesday, Putin held a joint press conference with Scholz, at which he said that peace in Ukraine would only be possible when Kyiv starts implementing Minsk II. Ukrainian President Zelensky told the BBC some EU countries play along with Russia, which is wrong. For whatever reason, it's worth noting that Britain has made little reference to the Minsk agreement, stressing instead that Ukraine shouldn't be dictated to by world powers over its head. Indeed, one interesting note in how the world is changing, Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a social media post yesterday urging Russia not to attack Ukraine. "We are on the edge of a cliff," he said, but President Putin still has time to step back and think. "We urge everyone to get involved into dialogue. The Russian government should avoid doing what would be a disastrous mistake for the country." Now, was that on Twitter? Facebook maybe? Well, no, it was actually in Chinese and posted on Weibo, the Chinese Twitter alternative. Think about that and why it might now be a priority to get that sort of message in front of the Chinese people. It's worth noting that although China recently issued a statement of support, saying that Moscow's security concerns must be guaranteed by the West and opposing the alleged threats to Russia's security from NATO, given the parallels, it's not surprising that that was always going to be the case, but foreign policy analysts have pointed out that is not necessarily a guarantee that China would offer its approval of a Russian invasion against Ukraine. China has had friendly relations with both Russia and Ukraine, and during the crisis, China has criticised the West many times, but has never criticised Ukraine. Indeed, the Chinese ambassador to Kiev published an article recently emphasising that China has always supported Ukraine's independence. So it could well be that the state of public awareness in China could be, to some degree, a relevant factor. And I think we can presume that the post on Weibo wasn't Boris Johnson's idea, let's put it that way. The Russian embassy in China hit back, by the way, after Johnson's post had had over 1 million likes. This statement is designed to further inflame the hysteria surrounding the so-called imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine and is absurd, it said. Meanwhile, Russia gave a more formal response to the US, which had previously given no ground on Moscow's demands. Unless Ukraine is barred from joining NATO, it said, then Russia will resort to, quote, military technical action. In addition, it repeated demands for an end to NATO expansion and rolling back NATO infrastructure to where it stood in 1997, which would mean the withdrawal of NATO troops and equipment from former Warsaw Pact countries that joined it in the early 2000s. None of that is seen as palatable or achievable by the West, but it represents, if you like, an extreme opening position for negotiation. It's also interesting what else Russia's doing right now, because as well as flexing its muscles on the Ukrainian border, it's also conducting large-scale naval exercises in the seas between Russia and Japan. According to Japan's defense ministry, 24 Russian warships have been training in the Sea of Okhotsk, close to the disputed Kuril Islands, held by Russia and claimed by Japan. Nobio Kishi, the Japanese defense minister, said that a large-scale exercise by the entire Russian military fleet at this time of year is highly unusual. Now, Japan has no strategic interest per se in Ukraine, but would be expected to side with NATO and would be likely to take part in sanctions against Russia should it proceed with an invasion. It does seem as though something has shifted on all of this, as opposed to the last few weeks where predictions of imminent invasion seemed unconnected to what was happening on the ground. Various commentators close to the action have now started to say, just in the last couple of days, that it seems that Putin has finally made a decision to push ahead. Now, nothing's definite, of course. Making all the moves and then still pulling back anyway could be part of the game plan, never counted out. But it seems that we will now see, sooner rather than later, how this is likely to play out. Now, in a minute, we'll get on to the rest of the week's news. But first, there won't be a deep dive video on Monday next week. I will be trying out something slightly different, a shorter topical response to a single current topic that is in the news. I'll be interested to see what you think of it when it appears. So join me for that, going live at 7 p.m. UK time on Monday. The EU's internal conflicts kicked into a higher gear this week as the European Court of Justice ruled that the EU can cut funds to countries based on rule of law issues. This threw out a legal challenge by Poland and Hungary, which have had threats of large-scale payments being withheld based on recent laws they've passed, considered by Brussels to be against the spirit of EU membership. The ruling marks a key moment in the power struggle, threatening to pull Europe apart. The court said that adherence to European values isn't merely an obligation to attain membership that can be abandoned after a country has become part of the club. Polish government spokesman Piotr Mulier slated the ruling, arguing that it was the latest confirmation that the Court of Justice and the EU institutions extend the functioning of legal provisions beyond the EU treaties. Notwithstanding some heated rhetoric, the ruling almost certainly does not authorise the EU to cut funds to Hungary simply over rules it doesn't like, such as the recent measure against the teaching of LGBT issues to children. It focuses instead on more structural issues, the erosion of judicial independence allegedly taking place in Poland, and instances of financial corruption with EU money. But there's no doubt that some of the other laws have sharpened the appetite of MEPs to urge the Commission to use its confirmed power aggressively to bring the rogue states to heel. So, for instance, Parliament President Roberta Metsola tweeted that the Parliament now expects the European Commission to apply the conditionality mechanism. This comes as Hungary's Viktor Orban is fighting for re-election in the face of a strong challenge from an opposition party alliance. Whether the EU pushing to remove funding for Hungary will support Orban with his campaign against the elites, or his opposition as potential leaders who will secure the funding that Hungary needs, that remains to be seen. The EU is also focusing on the accusation that the elections in Hungary are not fair. Europe's election watchdog, with the thoroughly European acronym of OSCE-ODIHR, already complained about the 2014 and 2018 elections, saying that biased rules made them, quote, free but not fair. With the tightness of the polling and the fond wish now very keenly felt by commissioners that they'd like this election to remove one of their two biggest headaches, they are taking a closer interest. The ODIHR have recommended a full-scale election observation mission with 200 election observers to properly monitor the election day procedures. Whether that recommendation will actually be fulfilled is another question. EU member states have generally been pretty reluctant to send election observers to check on other member states' elections. They wouldn't like it if it was done to them, after all. Meanwhile, as I record this episode, the UK is being battered by so-called Storm Eunice, a beast of a windstorm that has resulted in very rare red warnings for the southwest and for London. Red warnings mean there's a pretty good chance of debris flying through the air in a potentially lethal manner, and it means lots of trees are definitely coming down, so maybe a good day to stay at home. As always, this has resulted in the most excitable climate voices flapping their arms about in a panic, because we are now in a world where any bad weather will provoke that reaction regardless of whether there are actually links to climate change or not. So, XR Cambridge, who mocked up what they felt the BBC should be saying about it. Second named storm of the week wreaks havoc as climate breakdown shakes UK. And a Green Party activist, Storm Eunice is dangerous. Climate science is clear that these storms will get stronger and more frequent. It's being compared to the Great Storm of 1987, which is not expected wholly to match, but which also came as one of a pair. So yes, such things do happen sometimes. Does climate change mean that they happen more? On this specific topic of windstorms, the latest IPCC assessment has little to offer on the topic of mid-latitude windstorms. It says that there is low confidence in most regions relating to severe storms, which means limited evidence or limited agreement. And in the detailed report, it adds, there is limited evidence for windstorms and convective storms. Climate scientist Peter Thorne pointed out that such an evidence-based statement is even weaker than a confidence-based statement. In Chapter 11, Section 11.7.2, the latest report gives low confidence in historical changes, low confidence in attribution, medium confidence that future changes overall will be small globally. Storm surges and extreme rainfall, those are factors that have been made more likely, but not windstorms of this sort. And indeed, the UK Met Office also said in its State of the Climate report in 2020, there are no compelling trends in maximum gust speeds recorded by the UK wind network in the last 5 decades. None of that has stopped Twitter being alive with people utterly certain in their conviction that this is all part of climate breakdown, and so on and so on. Crying wolf, not a concept they seem overly concerned about. Now in Canada, Harsh winds are blowing there as well, metaphorically, if in no other way. Several of the organisers of the truckers' protests have now been arrested, as Justin Trudeau has taken on extraordinary powers under the Emergencies Act to act against them. The demonstrators have been warned that they face arrest, as well as having their trucks seized, their insurance suspended, and their bank accounts frozen. Indeed, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland has confirmed that the government has already begun freezing truckers' bank accounts. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association said that it is intending to take the government to court over its use of the Act in this way. At the same time, the financial institutions have been barred from any actions that may help to channel funding towards the protesters, and that even included the government sanctioning 34 crypto wallets that were held to have those sorts of connections. Donations that were previously channeled through the Give Send Go website have been revealed in a hack of the site, exposing names and email addresses of donors and leading some of those donors to being deluged with threats and harassment. Opposition politicians said that Trudeau's actions have made an already tense situation worse. He defended his actions, saying that they were needed to protect the national economy, public safety, and US relations. I think it's fair to say that Trudeau's Canada has taken the most draconian action in the face of protests so far related to COVID-19, at least ones that have been largely peaceful, albeit extremely disruptive. It does seem as though he's carrying the majority with him. According to a poll published yesterday, 2/3 of Canadians support the use of the Emergencies Act and want the Freedom Convoy cleared out. 54% were critical on how politicians had handled the protests, so while they might support the latest action, by implication only because they want it done with, rather than because they think the leadership has been doing a fabulous job. But that 2/3 majority also solidly lines up against any politicians that have given their support to the convoy protesters. 68% of Canadians said that they believe any politician who either contributed to or supported the protests should be voted out of office. Whatever else has happened over the last few weeks, Canada has done a bunch of catching up with its southern neighbour when it comes to polarising its population. Eric Adams is the newly elected mayor of New York. Now, I don't know much about him. I saw him on some show, I think it was Bill Maher, and he came across as intelligent and personable. However, this week my opinion of him went down massively because of one thing that he said. He attacked the press for what he described as unfair coverage of his early days in office as Mayor of New York. Well, so far so normal, standard political fare, but he then suggested that the reason why he was being covered critically was, quote, a lack of diversity in newsrooms. I'm a black man that's the mayor, but my story is being interpreted by people that don't look like me. Diversify your newsroom so I can look out and see people that look like me and say we're going to write stories based on the prisms that we have. That's not what we're getting. And that's why I'm covered the way I'm covered. Oh dear. This must be the latest example of how having identity politics talk around you all the time rots your brain, or at least makes ridiculous things seem somehow logical to you. Shall we count the ways? 1. This is an insult to all New Yorkers. The mayor is there to exercise a public office on behalf of the whole city. The idea that only people of the same race as the mayor will be credited as legitimate voices of criticism, that is an abnegation of duty. Second, it's specifically an insult to those journalists who have been told that the only reason they might be critical of how the Mayor Adams is doing his public job must be because of racism. Well, presumably that means they went a lot easier on his predecessor Bill de Blasio and other white mayors in the past. Except that no, they didn't. The relationship between mayors and press in New York has been notably stormy throughout history. De Blasio, Bloomberg, you name it. So he's either insulting them because he genuinely fails to notice that he's being treated the same, not differently, or he's insulting them because he is cynically calculating that using the race card might cow them into reining in the critical coverage for fear of being labelled as racist. That second one is worse than the first, in my view. And then third, it's also an insult to black New Yorkers specifically, suggesting that if you share his skin colour, that means you must think like him or be more inclined to approve of what he's doing on the basis of that shared skin colour. That seems to presume a lot. And finally, his words are an enormous insult to himself. Well, at least he can hold himself accountable for that. Showing the world that you're not ready for leadership because you blame others where in fact you should take responsibility. The world is the way the world is. The question is, how are you going to be competent in dealing with it in order to get the best outcomes on behalf of the people who elected you? They didn't elect you to whine and to lay blame. They elected you, pretty recently mind, because you promised you could get things done, presumably. And this is really what I get from this. We can focus on this one case of Eric Adams and talk about how it's all about American identity politics and all the bad things that can come with that. That's the language of parlance it's happening in, and it's corrosive for sure. But it's really a reflection of a failure of character and leadership, the nature of which is very common and a lesson that we can all learn from. It comes down to how you frame life's challenges. Why should you imagine you get to frame life as being a neutral canvas on which you're allowed to paint whatever you want without resistance? Life is never like that. Politics certainly isn't. There are always obstacles. The challenge of life is how you overcome the obstacles and what you manage to achieve in spite of them. Not what you'd be able to do if everyone just smiled warmly at you and asked how they could help you do what you want to do. Blaming the obstacles the first time they present themselves simply highlights someone who was not ready for the task. It's a shame. I'm not especially hopeful now for the success of New York's mayor, not unless he can learn some hard lessons pretty quickly. The rest of us, however, we can learn those lessons from his example rather than having to make the same mistake ourselves, something we can decide to do regardless of skin colour or any other group identity because it's a universal principle. All right. My thanks as usual to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not, as you know, spend the time making these videos if it weren't for them. Hopefully at some point it will grow to the extent where I can spend all my time on it instead of just most of my time. As you can tell from this week, it's a little way off at the moment. If you'd like to bring it a little bit closer by adding your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.